I believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear them. So come with me as we take a walk down Fascination Street. Hey guys, if you like what I'm doing, click the Amazon banner at the top of the homepage on FascinationStreetPod.com and do all of your shopping through Amazon. Once you click on it and it takes you to Amazon, you can bookmark it or add it to your favorites and you won't have to go to my site each time. It helps me keep the show going, and again, thanks for listening. Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with JP Emerson. JP is a car enthusiast and journalist who writes for publications such as Hot Rod, Mopar Muscle, Ford Muscle, Mustang Monthly, and the Motor Trend Group. He's also been featured on Garage Squad TV, Ford Performance, Corvette Online, and a bunch of other stuff. One of the coolest things about JP is that he wants to hear everybody's stories. Much like this podcast, where I want to hear everybody's stories, but he wants to hear everybody's stories which are focused on and around automobiles. So as you'll hear in this episode, I put a call out to all you good streetwalkers to go to this man's website at jpemerson.com and click on that link to tell him your story. And when you do, you never know where you might see that story end up. So enjoy, folks. This is car enthusiast and automotive journalist JP Emerson.
Yeah, talk to me, yeah.
Welcome to Fascination Street Podcast, JP Emerson. How are you doing today, JP?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I cannot complain. So, I think that we first got on each other's radar, I guess tangentially through the CarCast podcast with Matt D'Andrea, and maybe even Shift and Steer with Matt D'Andrea.
That sounds correct, yep.
That does sound correct. So, JP, tell me about where you grew up. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born and raised up in the Northeast in the Pennsylvania area. Lived there through a good portion of my childhood, and then I pretty much was all over the board, up and down the East Coast, different periods of time, all the way through the present day.
So you're on the East Coast now?
That's correct.
Very cool. I'm just going to guess you're somewhere in the, I don't know, mid-40s?
You can go ahead and guess that.
So, did you go to college?
I did not.
Oh, sweet. My kind of guy. Now, what first got you interested in automobiles?
Good question. I think really it was just the look and the sound of some of them. As a young guy growing up, you're drawn to a lot of things that you see, maybe older siblings or friends or family members that they have interest in. And during that generation, it was a big heyday for American muscle cars, Corvettes, Mustangs, Mopars, etc. So really it was probably more through osmosis than anything.
So what kind of cars back then really, I guess, sparked your interest? Was it specifically those American muscle, or was it, some of the stuff coming in from around the world?
Well, I think at that point in my life when I was fairly young, I didn't know there was another part of the world, let alone cars coming from there. I knew the big exhaust, the shackled up cars, the Krager mags. So I guess it was more of the type of things that you would see on the streets in the different places that I lived. Camaros were big, Mustangs were big, Mopars were also big, although I did not see as many of them earlier on. But, at that time, they weren't new vehicles. They were more of a second-generation vehicle by the time I was getting interested in them. So they were a little more affordable, and you saw a lot more people driving them.
What kind of cars did your family have during that time?
It was a typical American family, sensible cars. I can remember a couple of Ford Falcons, a Torino, some Oldsmobiles. I'm sure it was pretty much whatever was affordable and practical at the time. Nothing really too sporty or out there during those early years.
So when you got your driver's license, did you already have a car that they were going to let you drive, or did you have to go get your own ride?
No, I actually purchased my first car on my own, which was a 1965 Mustang. And that is what I drove essentially the wheels off of and rebuilt several times for many, many years.
Now, is 65, is that the one where they had like a half year? Was it like 64 and a half or 65 and a half or something like that?
Well, 65 is technically considered the first year of the Mustang, although 64 and a half was when they were being produced, but there are no official 64 and a half Mustangs. They started with the model year 65. 64 and a half refers to the date that they were manufactured, but they were all titled as 65s.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So, do you remember how much you paid for that car?
$2,200 for my very first car, which was a large amount of money at that time. Essentially, I had no money to put gas in it after I purchased it.
Now, was that, at that time, was gas probably the most expensive it had ever been up to that point?
I think actually gas was pretty inexpensive at that time, but it was a choice between gas and insurance, and unfortunately and embarrassingly, I hate to say that there was a long period of time where gas took precedence over insurance, but I really don't like to tell that story.
Well, I think that's pretty common. I remember, when I was, struggling late teen, early 20s, I tell you what, insurance was so expensive. I mean, it's wildly more expensive now, but it just seemed like, especially since, I was doing it by myself, I mean, it was just insane how expensive it was. So there was probably close to 5 or 6 years where I did not have insurance either.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. I know quite a few people that earn their bones on the streets without insurance. So, yeah, I'm sure we are not in a small group.
Yeah, no way. No way. What do you think that car is worth today?
My original one?
Yeah.
If it still exists, it was a basic V8, nothing special about it. So I would say if it were restored, I would say it's probably in the $18,000 to $20,000 range.
Interesting. So it would cost a lot more than that to restore it, wouldn't it?
At least that much to restore it, yes.
Nice. So what were the circumstances that led you to get rid of that car?
Well, I think at the time it had served its purpose. I had rebuilt the engine a couple of times, and all the wears and tears of daily driving, especially as a young person, which are a little more harsh than they may be today. So I think it was time to move on to something else. I had known some people that were interested in the car had I ever decided to sell it. Again, at the time, they were still fairly inexpensive to purchase, so I ended up selling the car to an individual who was going to, quote, fix it up and give it to one of their kids to drive.
Oh, sweet. So you mentioned that you rebuilt the engine a couple of times. Where did you learn how to work on cars and rebuild engines?
I initially learned how to identify things and work on cars, believe it or not, by building scale model kits as a kid. I didn't teach you the ins and outs, but I can identify what I was looking at because I had built so many of the kit growing up. There was also a book put out by a company, I believe it was called Chilton's, which essentially was how to rebuild your engine for dummies. And I put many grease marks and stains on that on the fender of that first car, basically through trial and error, tearing things apart and putting them back together just by looking at that book.
So for everybody who's listening who doesn't know what he's talking about, back then the internet used to be on paper.
That's correct.
And so at Chilton's Guide, they sort of made one for every car and every make and all that. And it was basically YouTube in a book about how to fix everything in that particular vehicle. It was very vehicle specific.
That's true. That's true. It was the Bible.
Now, I don't know, do they still make those manuals, those Chiltons?
I would assume they do. I would hope so. Not everybody has access to the internet yet. YouTube has come a long way, and you can find many, many things and many people to help you on the internet, specifically forums, etc., for your specific car. But there's nothing quite like holding that book in your hand and looking at it and figuring it out on your own.
That is 100% true. This is going to sound super weird, but I remember back in the mid to late 80s, the most use or the most times that I guess I saw a Chilton was when, different people, uncles and whatnot and cousins and things were rebuilding their AMC Gremlins.
Yeah, Gremlin.
Between Pintos and Gremlins, my family must have had probably a good dozen to 15 of those things combined.
Yeah, you have one of those. You have about 20 square yards of glass behind you too.
Yeah, no kidding. And one of the things that I thought was really odd, I don't remember what year it was, but it was like a 1983 Pinto and like a 1982 Mustang, somewhere around there. A lot of those parts were interchangeable, like a lot of them.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts that are interchangeable with a lot of different manufacturers. It comes in handy, especially for the guy on the shoestring budget that, you can buy a part for one car that's actually cost a little less than the car that you're trying to rebuild, simply because it doesn't have the name attached to it. But yeah, that was not uncommon.
I actually knew a lady who had a Mustang, and then her husband had a Pinto, and I guess they got into some sort of an argument about why it was taking him so long to fix her Mustang. And so while he was at work one day, I guess she dropped him off at work and in his car, and then she took his car back home and then pulled out whatever it was that she needed for her car from his car, and so now her car ran and his didn't.
That's a great story.
Oh man, that cracked me up. That's the only reason I even knew that you could put some Pinto parts in a Mustang and it'd work.
Not surprising.
So when did you decide to, what got you into journalism? For those who don't know, JP writes a lot of articles for different car magazines and things like that. So when did you get the journalistic bug?
I guess pretty much in high school is when I really got into it. For many years, I always kind of had the knack for it, and I always did well in those classes in school. So I initially started writing for the school newspaper, which eventually blossomed into covering high school sports for the local newspaper, meeting people and having people give me information and tips on how to come across better and make it more readable for someone that's getting that information for the first time. That's really when I got into it. And as far as the cars go, I'd always been a car guy, and picking up those magazines, Hot Rod and Mustang Monthly and Super Chevy or Mopar Muscle or the like, they had interesting stories. They had great stories. And I thought, I could do this. It blends something that I'm interested in the cars and in writing about them as well. But it was a long, long road to finally getting to that point. But that's what really got me started.
So some of those publications that you mentioned that sort of sparked your interest, you have been published in some of those things. So what was the feeling from having picked it up and thumbed through the pages and thought, hey, this is pretty cool, I like this, I can do this, to actually getting published in those particular magazines? What was that feeling like?
The first one was obviously, pretty exciting. You work a long time to just get your shot, and when you finally get it and you see your work in print, it's twofold. It's satisfying knowing that something you did was deemed worthy enough to be printed, and it's also satisfying to know that the subject matter that you're writing about, the car, the individual, the story, that person that is reading your work for the first time, hopefully they're happy with the story you put together, but that's something that they're going to hold on to as well, because many times that's a dream for many car owners. So it was twofold in that regard.
And you said it took a long time to get to that point. How long?
Years. I would supply stories, actually ghostwriting. If you're not familiar with that, it's essentially doing the work and writing the stories, but not getting the byline. By byline, that's not getting your name mentioned that you actually wrote the story. So that was more of a almost like an internship. Let's see what you can do, and we'll go from there, to actually getting some work in your name in print, that you actually did this. And then, of course, once you get those, then you can fan out a little more by showing examples of your work and proving that, yes, this is me, this is what I've done, and here's examples, so that you can, you can broaden your horizons and write about pretty much anything.
So what are the kinds of articles? I guess they're still called articles when it's on the internet. So what kind of articles are you writing? Like, what could somebody expect to find? Like, are you doing like performance reviews? Are you doing personal stories about people in their cars? What specifically are you doing?
Well, I think what I like to do is to write stories in particular when they're automotive based, not necessarily about the car first. I like to include information about the car because the car is what all the readers have in common. They have an interest in that brand or that type of car or whatever that topic is. That's what gets them to your story. But I want to share the story of the owners, who they are, where they're from, how they came about it, why it's important to them. Are there any backstories? What do they like to listen to when they're driving it? Was it handed down to them? Did they purchase it themselves? Why is it special or unique to them? Because many readers find that they have similar stories. There's something about their car that's special to them. Those are the stories that I really like to get because it's much bigger than just the car. Presumably the car's going to be around long after you're gone. But this is an opportunity to share your story with a common theme, and that theme, again, being the car.
So this podcast, Fascination Street, is sort of built on the premise of everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear what they are. And so it sounds like you're doing the same thing, but specifically with cars. Now, you have a website, and on your website, I believe there is a clickable link where you ask people to tell you their story. How often does somebody click that link? I mean, you must have thousands and thousands of people's stories by now, right?
I have many stories, yes, but surprisingly, you would think that, for instance, if you went to a car show and there's a couple hundred cars of all makes and models, you would think if you went and spoke to each one of those owners and said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about your car and possibly, publish a story, put it in a magazine, let's get it on the internet. You would think that majority of them would say, yeah, that'd be great. But actually, it's just the opposite. Majority of them, when you talk about their car, most of them don't feel it. Either their story or their car is worthy. They look at magazines and, you see the cover car or the stories inside, and many of them think, these cars are perfect. These are trailer queens. These are concourse cars. These are things that you see at Barrett-Jackson or Pebble Beach. And those are great. Those are great cars. They're great examples, and they have great stories. But by and large, the everyday guy, they have cool stories too, and they have cool cars, and they don't have to be perfect. And getting them to understand that it's okay to show the flaws. It's okay to tell the stories that maybe you haven't told your kids. It's okay to do those things. There's interest in it, and there's relevance to it. And many times it's difficult to get people to open up and share about those. So that's really what the hardest part is actually getting people to share with you, which flies in the face of many people like to talk about themselves. I find the opposite to be true in many occasions.
Well, I am in the same boat. Sometimes getting people to tell their story is almost like pulling teeth because since it's their story and they're used to it, they don't really think there's anything particularly fascinating about it. And it kind of sounds like that's what you're talking about with cars and people's stories there.
Yeah, I agree. When you do get them, though, they have great stories to share. They're very grateful that you took the time not only to learn about their car, but to learn about them, their family, how they grew up, how they came to be who they are, and how they came to own the cars or former cars that they have. It's great to talk to those people and share those experiences with them.
I 100% agree.
Hey, streetwalkers. Well, you're not literally streetwalkers, but now that I've got your attention, I am Stephen O'Reilly, and I have a podcast called The Bar Star Podcast. And since you're listening to the Fascination Street podcast, I think you should check out my show. It's just as interesting without all the famous people, because Steve has connections that I just do not have. But if you dig podcasts about music, working musicians, and other random shit that I decided to talk about, based around music, of course, because that's what I do. I'm a working musician for the past 30 years. Then you need to check out the Bar Star Podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcast, on any platform, and make sure you check out barstarpodcast.com. Now back to the one and only Steve Owens and whatever the hell he was talking about.
Now, let's talk a little bit about about classic rock. I think I read on your website, I think it was your website, or it might have been one of your social media profiles, but it said that you are super into classic rock. Where did that come from, besides, the obvious radio stations?
Yeah, even from a small child, I had an innate ability to hear a song even one time and pick up the words and understand the beat and the story. At one time, I probably had a library of 2,000 to 3,000 songs that I could tell you every word to. I'm not quite sure how that came to be, as I'm not aware of any family member that is musically inclined, but that's kind of how it happened. Back in the early teen days, they for those that don't remember, possibly the late 70s, early 80s, there was a big push. Everyone had a boom box, a giant radio that they carried around with them, and I was among them. Constantly had the radio on, music playing, probably driving my parents nuts, but that's what we did. This was long before mobile phones and social media, and this is how we all lived and breathed.
Now, this is going to sound like an odd slice of culture, but did you spend a lot of time in drive-in theaters? Because that would sort of marry some of your loves, being in a car with the radio on.
No, I did not. I recall drive-in theaters very well, but no, I didn't spend much time, if any, there. Again, when you were in a car back then, it was typically an AM radio. FM was still the new kid on the block, and when there was FM, the stations would come and go. They weren't very strong, so your time was spent in the car with the radio on, with a cabin full of friends singing horribly to your favorite songs.
Now, do you travel at all to write some of these stories? And the reason I ask is, I live in a small town, and I'm sure that there are small towns everywhere, not just mine, that have, pretty regular car shows. My particular town has, I think, 4 different car shows every year that are annual, that just happen all the time. And then there's a restaurant. I guess it's a restaurant. It's sort of a 50s burger stand kind of a thing, sort of downtown in my little town, that every Saturday for, the 6 months to include the summer, they have like a hot rod night. Maybe it's every other Saturday or something like that. But so do you travel to different car shows and to do any of these journalistic endeavors?
I do from time to time, although not nearly as much as people may think. It would be very, very difficult to be traveling constantly and actually getting anything down on paper, especially now with the internet, social media, email. You can connect with many, many of these people just through those outlets, listen to their story, get a few pictures so that you know exactly what they're talking about, and then you can create an avenue to say, yes, this is something that I want to pursue. But it's not nearly as much travel as you would think. Auctions, yes, go to auctions, go to car shows, but I try to keep it, if at all possible, in close proximity to wherever I am at that particular time, because it's difficult to do.
What is the most expensive car that you've actually I guess, not necessarily touched, but been in front of. There's one I can't remember. It starts with an H, and it's like a crazy supercar. Oh, man. It's like a I don't even know how to say it.
Wow, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I've been in and around the original Ford GTs. I've been around the original Mustang prototype, many, car number one, serial numbers. Of course, being at auctions, you can see many of these multi-million-dollar cars, and they're great to see, and they're pieces of history. But I don't know if I can just name one. If you're talking muscle cars, then, it would be those early cars from the manufacturers that stand out. If you're talking dollars, Amelia Island, has Duesenbergs and Ferraris and one-of-a-kinds that are many millions, more millions than I will ever make or see in my lifetime. And it's great, again, to see them and to say that you've seen them. But at the end of the day, they're a car. To me, the story is what holds all the worth to me.
That makes sense. I think the coolest car I've seen actually in person was outside of one of Bobby Flay's restaurants in Vegas. It was a Pagani Hawaii I don't know how to say it, but that thing is insane. Well, so what car do you drive now? What's your daily driver?
I drive an SUV right now. It's great to haul stuff around when you need to. It's basically it's a to and from home and work vehicle. I see enough of the big bad muscle cars and cool cars that I can get my fill just by being around them and again talking to the owners. I just want to come and go safely and not have to worry about a paint chip or stone coming up and hitting anything that I'm driving. That's where I am right now.
That brings up a good point. I've been to LA a couple of times, and every time I go there and I see these really, really nice cars, because obviously LA has some amazing vehicles, I, in my rental car, am driving down these streets that feel like Beirut. It makes me wonder, why in the hell would anybody drive a nice car in LA where the roads are so shitty? And I ran into the same thing in Mexico. I'm like, I don't understand. I saw this beautiful Corvette, and that's on the same street where city buses regularly hit each other on accident and then just keep going. It was insane. I was on a bus in Mexico, and it was almost like the two buses wanted to change lanes, but they hit each other, and then they just kept going. They didn't even stop. And nobody on the bus besides me thought that was bizarre.
I'm all for people driving their cars. I'm all for people that don't want to drive their car. They would rather show it. It's their car. It's up to them to do what they want to do with it. It doesn't matter to me either way. I get the argument, if you have a car, you should be driving it. They were meant to be driven. Which is true. They're an automobile. They were meant to be driven. But at the end of the day, if it's sitting in your garage at night, then ultimately it's your decision what you do with it. If you want to drive your collector car, more power to you. I'd love seeing them on the road. And if you don't want to drive it, if you want to trailer it somewhere and show it off and take it out every now and then that's your right as well. I appreciate both of them, and I'm glad both of them in their own way share them with me, either on the road or on the show field, because that's the only time I'm going to get to see them.
Well, that makes sense. So, JP, you have written articles and stories for Hot Rod Magazine and Mopar Muscle, Ford Muscle, and Chevy Hardcore, as well as Corvette Online. So you don't focus on, you're not just a Ford guy, you're not just a Mopar guy, you're not just a Chevy guy or a bow tie guy or whatever they say. So I feel, and this might be a misperception on my part, but I feel like most of the people who write about cars sort of just focus or like a laser beam on one particular brand or style. How come you don't do that?
Well, to answer the first part of your question is, yes, I do write about all makes and models. I'm not a particular brand guy, although I know Ford's best simply because that's what I had growing up. I love the Camaros. I love the Corvettes. I love the Fords. I love the Mopars. And there's many, many of them that I would love to have. But Fords is what I had. That's what I could afford at the time. And that's what I learned on. So I know the ins and outs of them better than some of the other brands. That's not to say I don't know those as well. And I enjoyed learning about them, in particular when speaking with the owners or doing a story. That's how I'm evolving, hopefully to be a better writer as well. But yeah, that's a little different than what many people do when they write for one title or they cover one brand. I think the reason I don't do that is because, again, I'm not automobile first, person and story first, and automobile second. The automobile is the common interest. I enjoy, again, getting to know the people and their story, and I think that's why I can cover so many different makes and models, because there's interest in all of them. There'll be people that say, Mopar or no car, and that's great, and I can appreciate that. But when you really talk to many of them, deep down they'll say, hey, if given a choice, I'd buy a Mopar any time, but I've got a buddy that's got a great Camaro, and it's beautiful, and he's my buddy, and I support him, and I love that car too. I think that's why I'm able to do different things, is because I don't focus on the brand.
Well, that makes 100% sense. So where can people find, I mean, obviously we talked about some of the publications online or otherwise, but where can people find you on social media and some of these stories as well?
Well, social media is really easy. I only have one, and that's Twitter, and you can find me under Ford Muscle JP on Twitter. The only one that I use. My website, of course, is jpemerson.com. You can find me there. There's also a link on that website that will take you to many, many of my articles. There's probably just a handful on that site, but if you click down the bottom of that page, you'll see more of my articles. That'll take you to another page, and you can click through the articles. You can see where they were published, many of them anyway. That's where you can find me. I'm constantly writing for different publications. There's no one in particular, simply because I'm a freelancer. I also publish press releases and share that information, with PR companies, or do work for automotive websites just behind the scenes, or supplying content to them as well.
Now, on your website, I think I mentioned before, there's a link or a clickable link where people can tell their car stories.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody, and I'm putting a call out, everybody, I want you to go click on that link and tell your car stories. But when they do that, where might they find that story? Like, where would they go to actually see the story?
That depends. Obviously, if you're driving a Chevy, you're not going to find it in a Ford magazine or on a Ford website. So it would be more tailored toward the brand that you're telling me a story about. Or there's always a possibility that it could wind up somewhere else, depending on the story that you share. It's really difficult to say, but I would say if you're telling me about a Ford, you'll find it on a Ford site, a Chevy site, Mopar site, or the likes of Hot Rod or Mustang Monthly, or any of those are a distinct possibility when you submit your information and your story.
Gotcha. So I guess you answered it, but I guess what I was getting at is if they tell you your story is the place it ends up, on your website. And so I think you answered that pretty well. Thank you.
Sure.
Dream car, money not a factor. What's your dream car, JP?
Wow, how much time do you have?
How many cars do you have?
I'll start with Fords. An original Cobra or a 1965 R model Shelby would be top of my list. Both obviously are quite expensive, but since money's no object and there's a limited production of both, that would definitely be something to have. An early Corvette 50s would be great. Not really a muscle car quite yet when they were that young, but again, you don't see many of them, and it's more of a nostalgia type thing. Mopars, I could easily say, a Superbird, Charger, Daytona, any of those would work. Barracudas are cool. It really just depends on the flavor of the day. But there's some imports that would be cool to have too. Porsche or an Aston Martin. Any of those would be great. But again, dreaming's one thing. Some of those I'd just like to see in person as well.
Nice. Can I have one?
You can have all the ones that I don't have.
So I think that, and maybe you remember more of these details, but I think back in the, mid 80s or something, MTV had like this contest where it was like, I guess it was maybe the 30th anniversary of Corvette. And so like they gave away to one person one Corvette for every year that they made.
Yep.
Like up to that point. So I think it was like 30 Corvettes or something. Yep. Like, whatever happened to those, and what was the tax bill on that prize?
I do remember that, actually. I think they were giving away one for, it may have been 25 years, something like that. But I'm sure most of them were sold. I'm taking a look here. Yeah, 36 of them. Yeah, a gentleman from Long Island, I believe, won that. Yeah.
Oh, no, there's not even any parking in Long Island. Where are you going to keep 36 vets?
You keep them in your bank account when you sell them off.
Yeah, I guess so. If you would have won, would you have sold them?
Yes.
Hey, didn't even hesitate.
Yes. Not because they're Corvettes, but realistically, you look at someone like Jay Leno and his collection, and of course he's got people that are helping him keep that up and running, but he collects things that are unique or one-ofs or special to him. And I think I would probably do the same. I would sell that collection, possibly keep, a couple of them for myself because they were of interest to me, and possibly go out and find some others that have a little more relevance to what I was interested in at that time.
That makes sense. Well, JP, before I let you go, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about?
I think we covered quite a bit. I enjoyed talking to you, and I appreciate you taking the time and letting me tell my story a little bit. So that was a little reversal for me, but I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Well, JP Emerson, I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to hang out and let us get to know you a little bit better on Fascination Street. On the way out, if you could just hit your Twitter and your website again once more for everybody so we know where to find you. And I'm not kidding, Streetwalkers. I want y'all to click that button and tell them your car story.
My Twitter is Ford Muscle JP, and the website is jpemerson.com. And if you've got a story to share, I'd love to hear it. You never know where you might read it.
Now, if somebody has a story, does it have to be like, this was my favorite car and this is why, or this is a crazy thing that happened in a car, or?
I'm really interested in anything. I can't guarantee that some of the publications, would pick them up, because there's plenty that say, hey, this is a great story, but, just not for us.
Sure.
But if you got a cool story, it's not a story until it's told, so tell it.
Ooh, I like that. It's not a story until it's told. Ooh, let's go out on that. JP, thank you so much, man. You have a great weekend, all right?
Thanks, you too. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Take it easy.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. As always, thanks for listening, Streetwalkers. And don't forget, follow the show on Twitter at FascinationSTPD, on Instagram at Fascination Street Pod. Follow the podcast page on Facebook at Fascination Street Podcast. And of course, you can always email me at fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and rate us on iTunes. For the next 3 months, everybody who rates and reviews the show and sends a screenshot to fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com will get a free surprise gift mailed to them. Every single one of you. So do it. Thanks, Streetwalkers. Opening music is the song Magnolia from the 2014 album Intransigence, used with permission from Douglas Miles Clark. Closing music is Apollo from the 2001 album Into the Known by the band Sapphire. Thanks for hanging out with us and getting to know a little bit about our guest. We'll see you next time on Fascination Street.